The entire kitchen went quiet. The moment the judges tasted the dish, not the polite quiet of concentration. The kind of silence that fills a room when everyone already knows the verdict, and nobody wants to be the one to say it out loud. Head Judge Renee Fontaine set her fork down, slowly, the way someone does when they are choosing their next words very carefully. She looked at the man standing behind the station. Flour on his forearms, a small grease stain on his collar from what had clearly been a long morning, and she delivered the judgment with the practiced calm of someone who had done this messy times before. The technique is outdated, the concept is confused, and frankly, the dish feels like something from a different era entirely. The other two judges nodded without making eye contact with him. Nobody in that competition hall laughed out loud. But enough people smiled. Standing at the station in his worn apron, 43-year-old Stuart Aldrich absorbed the words without flinching. He nodded once, quietly thanked the judges for their time, and began wiping down his counter. He did not argue, he did not explain, he just folded his cloth, turned around, and walked back to the preparation area while the murmuring started behind him. Later, people would remember that moment differently. Some said he looked defeated, others said he looked like a man who had already survived something far worse, and knew exactly how small this was, by comparison. They were right about the second part. Stuart Aldrich had spent 22 years cooking in northern Ontario, before anyone outside his community ever heard his name. He grew up in Sudbury, the son of a Finnish-Canadian mother, who believed food was the most honest language a family could speak, and a Scottish-Canadian father, who ran a hardware store, and never once complained about eating the same 3 meals on rotation. Stuart learned to cook the way most people in his generation learned anything practical. By watching, by failing quietly in the kitchen, and by paying attention to the things nobody wrote down in recipes. By his mid-20s, he was running a small restaurant on Larch Street with his wife, Adele, who handled the books and the charm, while Stuart handled everything that came out of the kitchen. The place seated 32 people on a good night, and smelled like birchwood smoke, and butter and whatever wild mushrooms he had foraged that week along the trails north of the city. It was never reviewed in a major publication, it was never nominated for anything. But people drove 2 hours from Sault Ste. Marie to eat there, and they almost always came back. Adele died in March 6 years ago, from a pulmonary embolism that announced itself without warning on a Tuesday morning when she was sitting at the kitchen table doing payroll. She was 40 years old, their son, Finn, was 9. Stuart closed the restaurant 4 months later. Not because he had to, financially, but because walking into that kitchen every morning, and cooking without her, sitting at the small desk, near the back door, was something he could not make himself do. Every dish he prepared felt like it was missing something essential, that had nothing to do with ingredients. For 2 years, he cooked almost nothing beyond what Finn needed to eat. Scrambled eggs. Soup from a can, sometimes. Pasta with butter on evenings when even the smallest effort felt impossible. Finn never complained. He was the kind of child who understood, even at 9, and then 10 and then 11, that his father was carrying something heavy and needed time to put it down. Slowly, the cooking came back, first as necessity, then as habit. Then, one winter evening, when Finn was 11 and a snowstorm had knocked out the power for 6 hours, as something that felt almost like peace again. They ate by candlelight, a venison stew. Stuart had been building for 3 days, and Finn said it was the best thing he had ever tasted in his life, which was probably not true, but felt true enough that night. It was Finn who eventually said, the thing that changed the direction of the next 2 years. He was 13 by then, doing homework at the kitchen counter on a Thursday evening, while Stuart worked on a lamb dish he had been developing quietly for months. A riff on something Adele's grandmother used to make in Quebec, updated with ingredients from the boreal landscape. Stuart knew better than anywhere else. Finn looked up from his textbook and said, without any particular dramatic intention, "Dad, you should enter that competition. The one on TV, the serious one." Stuart told him no, he said he was too old and too regional and too out of practice. Finn went back to his homework and said nothing more about it. But the idea stayed. The Canadian Culinary Heritage Competition was not technically a television competition. Though it had been broadcast as a documentary series twice in its 12-year history, it was first and foremost a professional evaluation, held annually in Ottawa, judged by a rotating panel of some of the most recognized names in contemporary Canadian cuisine. Chefs competed across 3 categories: classical tradition, regional innovation, and heritage revival. The heritage revival category was created specifically to honor food knowledge and techniques at risk of being lost, as the industry moved toward increasingly globalized palates. Stewart entered the heritage revival category. He had never competed in anything formal in his life. The application required a written submission describing the dish concept, its cultural roots, and the chef's relationship to the tradition being honored. Stewart wrote his in longhand first, at the kitchen table late at night after Finn had gone to sleep, then typed it up over 3 evenings, changing almost nothing from the original draft. He wrote about his mother's Finnish-Canadian kitchen, about the concept of taakut, a Finnish tradition of communal work, of showing up for your neighbors not because you were asked to, but because that was simply what you did. About how she translated that value into food, cooking not for occasions, but for the ongoing daily life of the people around her. About the dish he was developing, a slow braised game and root vegetable preparation, rooted in subarctic preservation techniques. With elements that reflected the Métis and Anishinaabe food traditions, he had learning to understand, carefully and respectfully, from community members in the region where he had built his life. He did not know if the application was well written. He submitted it on the last possible day, and did not mention it to Finn for 2 weeks. He was accepted. Finn found out when he noticed the confirmation email open on his father's laptop, and came into the garage where Stewart was reorganizing shelves just to stand in the doorway and grin, without saying anything. "It doesn't mean anything yet," Stewart told him. "I know," Finn said. He was still grinning. The 3 months, between acceptance and the competition, were the most focused period of cooking Stewart had experienced since before Adele died. He woke before 5 most mornings, worked the dish from different angles, adjusting the fat rendering on the game meat, reconsidering the acid balance, researching the historical use of juniper and Labrador tea in northern preservation. On weekends, Finn sat at the kitchen island, doing whatever he was doing on his phone, occasionally tasting things when asked, occasionally offering opinions that were more useful than Stewart expected. "The first version is better," Finn said one Saturday in February, pushing a bowl back across the counter after tasting the 7th iteration. "How is it better?" "It tastes like you actually care about it. The new one tastes like you're trying to impress somebody." Stewart looked at him for a moment. Then he went back to his notes. He did not enter the competition trying to impress anybody. He entered it because something in him needed to know whether the years of quiet work in an invisible kitchen, in a mid-sized city in northern Ontario, had produced something real. Not for a prize, not for recognition, but for the answer to a question he had been asking himself since the night he closed the restaurant. Whether what he had been doing all those years actually mattered, or whether it had only mattered because Adele was there to make it feel that way. The drive to Ottawa took 4 hours. Finn sat in the passenger seat with his earbuds in for most of the highway, but somewhere past North Bay he pulled them out and asked whether his father was nervous. "Yes," Stewart said. "About what part?" "All of it." Finn put one earbud back in and left the other out. He arrived at the competition facility on a Wednesday morning in late March. The space was large and impeccably organized. Rows of professional-grade cooking stations, overhead lighting designed for camera documentation, volunteers directing competitors to their assigned areas with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times. Stewart found his station, checked his equipment, and began the slow mental process of narrowing his focus. He noticed during the first hour that most of the other competitors were younger. Not all. There were a few chefs clearly in their 40s, but the majority were in their late 20s and early 30s, and they moved with the particular confidence of people who had trained in Michelin-recognized kitchens, and knew the language of this world fluently. They used equipment Stewart did not recognize. They discussed flavor profiles using terminology he had encountered in reading, but never naturally spoke. One competitor at the adjacent station had competed internationally, and wore it visibly, not with arrogance exactly, but with the settled ease of someone who belonged here without question. Stewart recognized his own foreignness to this environment clearly, and without resentment. He was a self-taught cook from Sudbury, who foraged mushrooms, and had been eating breakfast alone for 6 years. He was not supposed to be here, in the way most of these people were supposed to be here. He had made peace with that on the drive down. He focused on the work. The preparation went well. He had made this dish close to 60 times in the past 3 months, and his hands knew what to do without excessive thought. The braising liquid was right. The fat on the game meat rendered the way it was supposed to render. The root vegetables, parsnip, celeriac, wild carrot, softened to exactly the texture he wanted without losing structure. The juniper integration, which had taken him the longest to calibrate, came together during the final 15 minutes in a way that felt, for the first time, completely inevitable. He plated without rushing, he checked the temperature, he carried the dish to the judging table with both hands, and set it down carefully. Renée Fontaine was the head judge. She was one of the most respected food writers and culinary critics in the country, known for her deep knowledge of Canadian food history, and her absolute intolerance for nostalgia, deployed as a substitute for skill. The 2 chefs beside her had between them worked in some of the most influential kitchens in Montreal and Vancouver. Renée tasted the dish first, as was protocol. She set her fork down. She looked at Stuart with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely without warmth. "The technique is outdated," she said. "The concept is confused, and frankly, the dish feels like something from a different era entirely." The other 2 judges tasted and nodded. Stuart thanked them. He wiped his counter, he walked away. In the preparation area, a junior volunteer asked if he needed anything. He said he was fine. He stood at a window for a few minutes, looking at the parking lot and the gray March sky above it, and he thought about the drive home. About what he would tell Finn. He did not know yet that one of the volunteers had photographed his plating from across the room. He did not know that 2 food journalists attending the event had tasted the dish, independently from the judging samples. He did not know that one of those journalists, a woman named Delphine Okafor, who wrote for a national food publication and had been covering this competition for 4 consecutive years, had stood beside the judging table for the tasting and written 3 words in her notebook immediately afterward. She had written, "What just happened?" Delphine Okafor had been covering Canadian food culture for 11 years. She had seen a lot of competition cuisine, technically sophisticated, visually precise, conceptually interesting, and emotionally inert. She had tasted food that impressed her, and food that moved her, and she knew the difference between the 2 clearly enough to recognize it instantly when the gap was crossed. What Stuart Aldrich had placed in front of the judges was not technically flashy. It was not conceptually novel in the way the competition's scoring rubric was calibrated to reward. The plating was clean but not theatrical. There was no element of surprise in the presentation, no moment designed to provoke a reaction. What it was, she wrote in her notes, was profoundly coherent. Every element of the dish spoke the same language. The flavors were not layered for complexity but for truth, each component earning its presence not by contrast or tension but by belonging. The juniper did not announce itself. The game meat did not perform. The root vegetables did not apologize for being root vegetables. The dish tasted, she would later write in her piece, like a specific place, and a specific kind of love for that place, expressed through 40 years of livings inside it. She found Stuart in the preparation area, 10 minutes after the judging ended. He was washing a small pot at a side sink, which struck her as both completely practical and somehow characteristic of everything she had just tasted. She introduced herself. He recognized the publication. She asked if he would answer some questions for a piece she was working on. He said he had not done well in the competition, and she would probably be better served interviewing someone who had. She said that was not actually what the piece was about. They talked for 40 minutes. He told her about Sudbury, about Adele, about Talcoot and his mother's kitchen, and the years of cooking in obscurity, and what it felt like to close the restaurant, and why he had entered the competition. He answered her questions with the same directness and absence of performance that characterized the dish. He did not try to make his story more interesting than it was. He did not minimize it either. At the end she asked if she could speak with his son. Stuart considered this for a moment. "He's in the hotel," he said. "He brought homework." She smiled. "How old?" 15. "Tell him what the piece is about first." If he's interested, I'd like to include his perspective. Finn agreed immediately, with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask him about his father for some time. He spoke to Delphine for 20 minutes in the hotel lobby, while Stuart sat 10 feet away, reading the same paragraph of a paperback novel, 3 times without absorbing any of it. Finn did not perform either. He talked about the kitchen at home, about the way his father worked on a dish for months before deciding it was ready, about the venison stew during the snowstorm when Finn was 11, about the way the kitchen had felt different after his mother died, and then slowly different again as the cooking came back. He said, at one point, that his father was the most patient person he had ever met, and that he used to think patience was a quiet kind of giving up, but now he thought it was actually the opposite. Delphine wrote that down verbatim. She asked him what he thought about the judge's reaction. Finn shrugged with the specific casualness of a 15-year-old who has thought something through completely. I think they were wrong, he said. Not about the technique being old, it is old, that's the whole point, but wrong about what that means. The piece ran 6 weeks later. It was not the cover story, it was a long-form feature buried in the middle of the issue, the kind of piece that a magazine runs because someone believes in it, rather than because the algorithm suggested it would perform. The headline was "The Dish Nobody Scored, and Why It Might Be the Most Canadian Thing at This Year's Competition." It ran to 4,000 words, and included Delphine's account of tasting the dish, a conversation with a food historian at the University of Guelph about the preservation techniques. Stuart had revived several paragraphs about Tokut, and what it means in a contemporary Canadian context, and a photograph taken by the volunteer. Stuart plating the dish at his station, flour still on his forearms, looking at what he had made with an expression that was not pride exactly, but was something close to recognition. It also included a long passage from Finn, including the line about patience. The magazine put the piece online on a Thursday morning. By Friday it had been shared widely enough that Stuart's phone, which he almost never received messages on, from people he did not know, began to receive messages from people he did not know. By Saturday, 3 things had happened. A culinary program at George Brown College in Toronto had sent a formal inquiry about whether Stuart would consider delivering a guest lecture series on subarctic food traditions and boreal foraging. The organizing committee of the Canadian Culinary Heritage Competition had sent a letter, an actual paper letter, which struck Stuart as both formal and somewhat touching, acknowledging that the judging panel's comments had been reviewed internally, and that the committee would be revising its scoring criteria for the Heritage Revival category to better account for cultural depth and historical accuracy of technique. And a restaurant group based in Ottawa, a group that operated 4 mid-sized establishments focused on regional Canadian cuisine, had contacted him through the magazine to ask whether he would be available for a conversation about a potential collaboration. Stuart read the messages over 2 evenings, sitting at the kitchen table after Finn had gone to sleep, in the same chair where he had written the competition application in longhand. 6 months earlier, he did not respond to any of them immediately. He made himself a cup of coffee. He sat with it for a while. He thought about Adele, who would have had an opinion about all of this, very specific and very accurate, and who would have told him what to do with the kind of practical clarity that he had been improvising without ever since she died. He thought about what it felt like to cook the dish 60 times in 3 months, alone in the kitchen after midnight while Finn slept. About the way the juniper had finally integrated on the day he stopped trying to control it and simply trusted what he understood. He thought about what Finn had said, that patience was not a quiet kind of giving up, that it was the opposite. In the morning, he told Finn about the messages over breakfast. Finn listened carefully. He asked questions about the restaurant group and the college program. He was practical and specific in the way he had become over the past few years, in the way that kids who grow up watching a parent navigate real difficulty sometimes become. Then he said, "Which one do you actually want to do?" Stuart looked at him. "The college," he said, "and maybe the Ottawa thing, but only if it's actually about what I cook, not just a version of it that somebody else thinks will sell better." Finn nodded. "Then that's the answer." 6 months later, Stuart Aldrich was standing at the front of a classroom at George Brown College in Toronto, speaking to 23 culinary students about Labrador tea and the history of fermentation in subarctic communities. He had driven down the night before and stayed in a small hotel near the campus. Finn had come with him, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to see the school, and had a friend he was planning to visit in the annex the following afternoon. Stuart talked for 2 hours. He had prepared extensively, and then, in the final days before the lecture, abandoned most of the prepared material, and decided to simply cook and explain at the same time, the way his mother had taught him, the way he had spent 22 years teaching himself everything else. He brought his own ingredients. He borrowed a portable burner from the program coordinator, a calm and capable woman named Laurie Hendricks, who had organized the guest lecture series, and who made everything logistically easier without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing so. The students were attentive in the way students are attentive when they recognize they are being given something that will not appear in a textbook. A few of them asked questions that surprised him. One student, a young Cree woman from northern Manitoba, who was in her second year of the program, stayed after the room cleared out, and told him that 3 of the preservation techniques he had described matched practices her grandmother had used. Techniques she had never seen acknowledged in any formal curriculum. Stuart listened to her carefully. He asked questions. He wrote down the name of the community she was from, and the specific plants her grandmother had worked with. He told her he would very much like to know more, if she was willing to share it. She said she would think about it. He drove home to Sudbury the next afternoon with Finn beside him, earbuds in again past North Bay, one earbud out, the same as before. Somewhere south of Sturgeon Falls, Finn pulled both earbuds out and said, "How do you think it went?" "Good, I think. Better than the competition. The bar was pretty low." "Yes," Stuart said, "it was." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. The highway cut through boreal forest, spruce and birch, and the occasional flash of frozen lake between the trees. Stuart had driven this stretch of road hundreds of times. He knew every change in the landscape, every town that appeared and disappeared. He had driven it with Adele in the early years, arguing about music. He had driven it with Finn sleeping in the back seat. He had driven it alone in the months after Adele died. Sometimes just to have somewhere to go. It looked the same now as it always had. The forest did not record what passed through it. The highway did not care about any of it. But the man driving was not the same as the man who had driven this road in grief, alone, certain that whatever he had built was permanently behind him. "Dad," Finn said. "Yeah, are you going to do the Ottawa thing?" Stuart considered the question. "I think so, if the terms are right." "What does right mean?" "Means I cook what I know, not what somebody thinks the market wants." Finn nodded slowly. Outside the window, the trees moved at highway speed, light coming through in intervals. "Mom would have made you do it immediately," Finn said, "and then told you exactly how to negotiate the contract." "Yes," Stuart said. "She would have." A pause. "She would have been right too," Finn said. "She usually was." The partnership with the Ottawa Restaurant Group was formalized the following spring. The arrangement gave Stuart creative authority over a seasonal menu at one of the group's smaller establishments. A 50-seat room near the Byward Market that had been underperforming for 2 years and was willing to take the risk of a complete conceptual overhaul. The menu would change 4 times a year, built entirely around boreal and subarctic ingredients, with sourcing relationships that Stuart spent 4 months establishing personally, before a single dish appeared on the table. The restaurant did not make national news immediately. It did not need to. It filled consistently from the first month, not because of a wave of press, but because the people who came tended to come back and bring someone with them. Food people who had read Delphine's piece started arriving. Then people who had never read the piece, but had been told about the meal by someone who had. A quiet accumulation. Renee Fontaine came in November, unannounced, with a colleague. Stuart did not know she was there until the end of service, when the front-of-house manager, a young man named Crispin, who had a gift for reading a room, told him quietly while Stuart was cleaning down the pass. He thought about going out to speak with her. He decided not to. She sent a note to the restaurant 2 weeks later, addressed to him by name, written on cardstock, which again struck him as both formal and somewhat touching. She said that the tasting menu she had experienced was among the most intellectually honest expressions of Canadian terroir she had encountered in many years of writing about food. She said she had been wrong to evaluate his competition dish through the lens of innovation, rather than the lens of cultural continuity, and that this was a failure of the rubric, rather than the food. She said she intended to write about the restaurant and hoped he would consent to a proper conversation first. He agreed. The piece she eventually published was not an apology. It was something better. A genuine reconsideration. Written with the same rigor she applied to everything, that grappled honestly with why her initial reaction had been what it was, and what that revealed about the assumptions embedded in the way the industry evaluated worth. It mentioned Stuart's name and the restaurant's name. It mentioned Adele, briefly, in the context that Stuart had shared with her. It mentioned Finn's line about patience. By the time that piece ran, the reservation book at the Ottawa restaurant was full 3 months forward. Stuart drove back to Sudbury most weekends. Finn was 16 now, and did not strictly need his father home every weekend. But they had established a rhythm that neither of them seemed inclined to disrupt. Stuart cooked on Sunday evenings always, not restaurant food. Home food. The things his mother made, the things Adele had loved, the things Finn had grown up eating. The 3-day venison stew when the season allowed it. Finnish sour rye bread that took more patience than almost any dish he served paying customers. Soup from scratch, always. Finn still sat at the kitchen island doing homework, or whatever he was doing on his phone. He still tasted things when asked and offered opinions that were more useful than expected. He still occasionally picked up a tool and handed it over without being asked, the way he had done when he was small, and thought helping meant proximity. They did not talk about Adele every Sunday, or even most Sundays. But she was present in the kitchen in ways that did not require naming. In the bowl she had brought back from a trip to Quebec City that Stuart used for bread dough. In the particular way, the light came through the kitchen window, in late afternoon, that she had always said was her favorite thing about the house. In the recipe card in her handwriting, tucked inside a cookbook on the shelf, that Stuart had never moved and never planned to. He cooked around her absence the way a person learns to navigate a familiar room in the dark. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but with the knowledge of where everything is, and the understanding that the room is still yours, even when you cannot see it clearly. He was invited back to the Canadian Culinary Heritage Competition the following year as a guest judge. He said yes. He drove to Ottawa with Finn again, who was 17 now, and who sat in the passenger seat for the entire drive with both earbuds out, talking steadily about a school project he had been working on, a presentation about traditional ecological knowledge and its intersection with contemporary land management policy, which had apparently evolved significantly from its original scope. It started as a 5-minute presentation, Finn said, and now it's 20 pages. What happened? I talked to that student, the one you met at George Brown. We've been emailing for 3 months. Stuart glanced at him. She sent me sources, Finn said. I kept reading. Stuart said nothing for a moment. Does the teacher know it's 20 pages? She said to stop. I said I wasn't done yet. What did she say to that? Finn shrugged. She said okay. Stuart looked back at the road. The spruce trees moved past on either side. The highway unreeled ahead of them. Somewhere past Mattawa, the clouds broke, and the late afternoon light came through long and horizontal. The kind of light that exists in that part of the country, for about 6 weeks in spring and fall, and nowhere else quite like it. Stuart did not say what he was thinking, which was that Adele would have wanted to read every one of those 20 pages, and would have had notes, detailed and specific and accurate, about each one. Some things you hold rather than say. Not because they are too heavy, because they belong to the quiet, and the quiet is where they are most themselves. The Ottawa skyline appeared in the distance, low and familiar. Finn put one earbud back in, left the other out. If you have ever been told that what you know is no longer needed, that the way you do things is from the wrong era, that the world has simply moved on without you, you will understand what it means when someone finally proves that wrong. Not loudly, not dramatically, just by doing the thing they have always known how to do, one more time, until the room goes quiet, and the silence is the opposite of what it was before.